One of the most inflammatory passages in the Bible, and the most common quote used to claim that the Bible promotes rape culture, reads as follows. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her, and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. At first glance, and to our 21st century eyes, this does seem mind-boggling. What would you say in response? Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. Emily Buchwald, in her book Transforming a Rape Culture, defines rape culture. She writes that it is a complex set of beliefs that encourage male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. It is a society where violence is seen as sexy and sexuality as violent. In a rape culture, women perceive a continuum of threatened violence that ranges from sexual remarks to sexual touching to rape itself. A rape culture condones physical and emotional terrorism against women as the norm. In reading through various online sources to better understand what is meant by rape culture, there seems to be two major components. First, it is a culture within which sexual assault in a wide range of forms, not just rape, is the norm or is at least tolerated. It includes making jokes about sexual assault. It includes the objectification of women through online porn as objects of sexual gratification. It is a culture within which women are not safe and must take extra precautions. Sadly, that very much describes our 21st century culture. For example, just this past week, during Frosh Week at a university about an hour away from where I live, several first-year women were drugged and sexually assaulted by male students at a party on campus. This is a glaring example of rape culture in the 21st century. The second major component of rape culture is blaming or shaming the victim for what happened rather than the perpetrator. It can be rather blatant, as in the case of recent statements by Taliban leaders when they took over Afghanistan and said that women should stay indoors because their fighters were not trained on how to handle women. But it can be far more subtle than this when a man argues that the woman he assaulted had given her consent. Claiming that consent was given by the woman is the new way of trying to make the woman responsible for an assault. This second aspect of rape culture can be clearly answered when it comes to what God commanded in the Bible. It was the rapist that was held 100% responsible. An example given at Mount Sinai illustrates that very clearly. In the case where an engaged woman was raped in the field outside the city, the crime was treated like murder. Only the man was to be executed. It states, "You shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case." From start to finish, if a man raped a woman, only the man was held guilty. The woman was presumed innocent. It is the first aspect of rape culture that we need to dive into, especially in relation to the oft-quoted verse I mentioned earlier. Before we look at that, and since we are talking about an ancient culture 3,400 years ago, there are some questions we need to think about first. The first question is this. If you were asked to set some laws in place for a very different culture than this one here that we live in today, at a different time and place in history, could you simply draft those laws according to what you personally thought best? Or would you have to take into account whether that other culture was very different from yours? Here is why we need to think about this. Several years ago, I was participating in a philosophy graduate seminar led by ethicist Arthur Schaefer. During the course of this discussion, someone asked why we didn't simply draft laws that set the standard at the highest level required for a perfect society. Dr. Schaefer replied that if a law attempts to set too high a standard, the culture will see it as unreasonable or over the top, so to speak, and refuse to comply with it. This, in turn, would produce contempt for the law and eventually lead to an even worse state of affairs. Instead, he explained that often laws must fall significantly short of a perfect world so that society will see these laws as reasonable and comply with them. So what is my point here? It is simply this. A command given to an ancient culture may have come across a lot different to them than to us. And secondly, we should not assume that if God gave a command to an ancient culture, then that is what God desires. We see that illustrated by something Jesus Christ said about the command at Mount Sinai to do with divorce. Jesus said it was given because of the hardness of their hearts, but he actually hated divorce. The takeaway is that at least some of the commands God gave were not at all what he wants, but a minimum standard rather than a maximum standard due to the point that Dr. Schaefer brought out. With Schaefer's point in mind, we need to ask a second question. Have you considered what kind of culture God was speaking to at Mount Sinai? We are talking about thousands of people who just 3 months earlier were slaves with no rights whatsoever. They had been born into and spent their entire lives in brutal, forced labor and had been required to kill all their male babies. And all of this was within the historical context of ancient cultures some 3,400 years ago. Many aspects of these ancient cultures would be totally foreign to someone living in a 21st century Western culture. Given the historical context, coupled with Schaefer's point, we are faced with a third question. What kind of laws do you think you would have to draft such that they would have any hope of finding compliance by thousands of escaped slaves standing at Mount Sinai? What did the command say? Let's put that ancient command right on the table in plain view for all to see. It says, if a man finds a girl who is a virgin who is not engaged and seizes her and lies with her and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. First, did you notice that the man was required to marry the woman, but there is no requirement for the woman to marry the man? It leaves open the option to refuse, and we know from the case of Rebekah's arranged marriage to Isaac that the option to refuse did occur. Second, did you notice that only the man was prevented from ever divorcing her? No such requirement stated for the woman. But the most bizarre question still remains. Why would any woman consider, even for an instant, such a marriage when such a repugnant assault has taken place? And what about the 50 shekels of silver? In these ancient Middle Eastern cultures, marriages were arranged not for love, but to guarantee lifelong security and support for the woman. An unmarried woman could find herself with no means of support if her father died. This brings us to the payment of 50 pieces of silver to the father. What was that about? From another account in the book of Judges, we observe that a man accepts a job as a private priest to a family for an annual salary of 10 pieces of silver per year. In today's funds, if $10 an hour is on the lower end of the wage scale, the man who had raped a young woman would be required to pay an equivalent of just over $100,000 to the woman's father, or the equivalent of 5 years of wages. That way, if she refused to marry the man, the father would be compensated for providing for his daughter for the rest of her life. We should keep in mind that in those ancient cultures, all marriages were arranged with the woman's father. Love usually had nothing to do with it. Instead, it was the man's ability to provide for his wife that was the main factor. We may not like that in our culture today, but this was the world within which that command was given. It is important to remind ourselves that we are talking about practices of ancient Middle Eastern cultures which may be wildly off in comparison to what God desires. This law put all the power in the relationship in the hands of the woman. She could refuse the marriage, or she could marry, and if there was trouble, she could leave and return to her father, who had already been compensated to care for her for the rest of her life. In the words of one of my female colleagues with whom I discussed this, she said, "Powerlessness is a sensation felt by raped women, and gaining a sense of having power would help them heal. He took away her choice. The law gives it back to her." But it doesn't end there. In the very real likelihood that the rapist did not have the equivalent of 5 years of wages to pay the father of the woman, the law at Mount Sinai gives detailed instructions about indentured servants. The man would be required to go into servitude for 5 years. The 5 years of wages would be paid up front and given directly to the father, and the man would then work for someone for 5 years with no pay, only board and room, in order to work it off. Here's a question to consider. If you were tempted to assault another person and knew you would have to dish out roughly $100,000 as a penalty, would that be a deterrent for you? Especially if the woman refused to marry you and you got absolutely nothing in return for your $100,000. So what we see here is a command that appears to be morally repugnant to us in the 21st century, but interfaces with the culture of the day to provide a very large deterrent to rape and the power to the woman to choose what she would do. The rapist had no choice and would have to pay an automatic huge fine to 5 years' wages that would very likely put him immediately into indentured servitude for the next 5 years of his life. All of this highlights the difficulty a 21st century person might have in having sufficient knowledge and understanding of an ancient culture such that they could draft laws that wouldn't be outright rejected by that culture. That being said, have you seriously considered that there might be a massive difference between what sort of laws God gave that ancient culture at Mount Sinai and what he actually desires? In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Jesus indicates that at least some of the commands given at Mount Sinai fell vastly short of what God desires. They were merely a minimum standard. This brings us to the much more important question: what does God actually desire when it comes to a solution for rape culture? There are 2 commands God gave at Mount Sinai that are buried in the middle of a huge list of commands, but those 2 commands emerge in the New Testament as replacing the entire pile of commands he gave at Mount Sinai. What God actually desires centers around these 2 commands, and a great deal is said in the New Testament about how these apply to what God actually desires. He calls these 2 commands the royal law. So what are those 2 commands, you ask? Jesus said, "The greatest and highest priority of all is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind." And the second is similar. We are to love our fellow human beings as we love ourselves. He isn't talking about having warm feelings about other people. He is talking about a love that is much deeper and more powerful. Since we are looking at the problem of rape culture, let's start with what God desires by way of sexual attitudes that men have for women. Jesus said something highly relevant to rape culture and effectively set the bar higher than any culture has set it, including our own culture today. So what did he say? Jesus said, "Everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Did you notice that no exceptions are given? Not even any exceptions for how a woman might be dressed or behaving. In short, not even fantasies about rape in the privacy of one's own mind are tolerated by God. Unlike humans who often just worry about public appearances, this standard goes far higher to the extent of one's personal thoughts. Do you remember the second major aspect of rape culture? That the victim is somehow blamed or shamed for what happened rather than the perpetrator? What Jesus said makes both these aspects completely wrong, even within the privacy of one's own mind. Rape culture, from God's perspective, is totally, unequivocally wrong. It is a non-starter with God, and the penalty for practicing illicit activities, even within one's own mind, is eternal in nature. It could not possibly be more harshly condemned. Even within marriage, the New Testament commands the husband to love his wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So what does this mean when it comes to how a husband treats his wife? Basically, it means that the husband is to serve his wife as Christ served the church. He is to regard her as more important than himself. So how do we apply this seemingly impossible standard today and in our culture? What about online porn? By God's standards, if you are enjoying online porn, you are participating in something demeaning and dehumanizing to women in a sexual way, even if it is entirely in the privacy of your own mind. In short, you are participating in a culture that promotes the sexual abuse of women. Do you see how even in the 21st century, God's desired standard could be seen as so high it is unreasonable? So how can we possibly live up to that standard? I'll close with a suggestion. Divine standards require divine intervention. The only way this will happen freely and spontaneously in your own life is through divine intervention that puts you on a road to a pure heart and a beautiful mind. And if you're interested in hearing my own story, check out my video called Quest for a Beautiful Mind in the link below. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.